Welcome back. Okay, what is Black's next move and why? Extra points if you can tell me what this is called. Enjoy the lecture.
Now I get to talk about the end of the Odyssey and try to pull it all together for you. There's really no better place to start than Book 24, even though, as we'll see, Book 24 is rather strange. In explaining the strangeness of Book 24, though, we'll get pretty close, I think, to an understanding of what the Odyssey is all about, and in particular what the end of the Odyssey has to say about the themes we've been following all the way since the beginning when we started to talk about the Andra, the man, and the way Odysseus's adventures and his struggle for his nostos make him both a mythic hero unlike anything that we could ever be, and an embodiment of the things that we feel about our lives every day. To put it another way again, it's the Rudy thing. How is it that Odysseus embodies cultural truth values despite being obviously a very unusual, very heroic guy? And what does it mean to him to be that mythic guy? So why is Book 24 weird? Well, what does Book 24 consist of? It's got these three main elements, and none of them really seems completely necessary, and all of them seem kind of anticlimactic. It begins with the section that's usually called the second Nikuya. Now, Nikuya is a word that means the story of a corpse, literally, and it's the word that is used to refer both to Odysseus's trip to the underworld in his adventures and to what happens here in Book 24, where Hermes leads the souls of the suitors down to the underworld. And there they happen to pass by the souls of Agamemnon and Achilles, and Agamemnon and Achilles have a conversation that we're going to get into as we move along. But it certainly doesn't seem like it's telling us anything we really need to know about the story and the way the story is finishing up. And then there's the second element, which is even stranger, when Odysseus goes to see his father. Now, obviously, we want to have a reunion with his father, but there's an element of this reunion that's very, very strange, which is Odysseus lying to Laertes when there's absolutely no need to lie anymore. In fact, the bard of Book 24 actually calls attention to the strangeness of Odysseus's lying, because Odysseus makes a decision explicitly to lie to his father. There is the possibility of lying, there's the possibility of not lying. Odysseus thinks about it, as he often thinks about decisions in the Odyssey, and he decides to lie. And then finally, the third strangeness of Book 24 is the very end of the entire Odyssey, what I think of as the tacked-on non-battle between Odysseus and Laertes and Telemachus and their few followers and the families of the suitors who are coming to kill them because the suitors are now dead. It looks like it's going to be a tough battle, but we're expecting that Odysseus and Telemachus and Laertes are going to come out on top because, of course, Odysseus is such an amazing warrior. But then, all of a sudden, here comes Athena, and the battle's over, and apparently everything is going to be okay. I mean, talk about anticlimactic. So now the strangenesses are out there. What's really especially interesting about our feelings of how Book 24 doesn't seem to fit and how it's kind of strange is that it goes along quite closely with a feeling that was clearly there even in ancient times about the end of the Odyssey. To understand this fully, I need to explain a few things about the very oldest texts of the Odyssey. What's called the manuscript tradition of Homer, that is, the series of copies of copies of copies of the original texts of the Iliad and the Odyssey, got filtered through the famous Library of Alexandria, whose real name is the Museion, which just means place or establishment of the Muses. And from very early on, there was a lot of question about various features, not only of the texts of Homer, but of the texts of all of the classical authors. When you're dealing with a culture that has just discovered writing a couple of hundred years before, there is bound to be a lot of uncertainty in what it was that was actually first composed what it was that was actually first written down. And that tradition has given rise over thousands of years to the tradition that you and I are now part of, the classical tradition, the preservation of classical learning in contemporary times. One of the early things that editors of texts like the Odyssey did way back in Alexandria was to start to make comments on the way they thought the texts should actually look and the words that they thought should actually be there. These comments eventually became something that's known as the scholia, and several authors have scholia, but the Homeric scholia are the most important scholia of all because they go back the farthest and there are the most of them. And one scholion in the text of the Odyssey tells us that Aristarchus, who was one of the first librarians of the Museion of Alexandria, was of the opinion that the telos, a Greek word which usually means end, but can also mean goal or even fulfillment, the telos of the Odyssey was at the end of Book 23 when Odysseus and Penelope finally get together, if you know what I mean. Over the centuries, there has been a great deal of debate about what it was that Aristarchus meant when he wrote in his note on Book 23 of the Odyssey that at the end of Book 23 was the telos of the Odyssey. Some people think it just means that Aristarchus thought that was where the story more or less came to an end, and he was kind of saying, well, I too recognize that Book 24 is weird and kind of tacked on, and I wish it weren't there. But there's an even more intriguing way to look at this, which is that Aristarchus was actually saying that the authentic Odyssey, as he knew it, ended there at Book 23. In fact, that's the most obvious meaning of telos. But the problem is that we don't have any versions of the Odyssey that end there, and so we're always going to be wondering about exactly what it is that Aristarchus meant. At the very least, it makes it clear that as early a critic as Aristarchus felt the same things that we feel about Book 24 and wondered why it was that Book 24 would be there. And let's use this as an opportunity to remember how the Odyssey came together, that is, as a series of songs sung by bards, recomposed night after night, such that a bard singing Book 24 doesn't have to be the same bard as is singing Book 23, and a bard's individual version of the Odyssey doesn't have to include Book 24. In fact, a bard's individual version doesn't have to include Book 1. I think if we really want to understand both what Book 24 is about and what the Odyssey as a whole is about, we have to have the bardic tradition in mind. And we have to realize that whatever bard it was who decided that Book 24 was a good idea maybe had a notion of what he was doing. And what I'm going to try to show in the next segment is that those three strangenesses actually have each of them something important to say about the action and the story of the rest of the Odyssey, and about the Andra and what the Andra means both as a regular guy and as a mythic guy.